So I had always been interested in that. And then number two, growing up, my dad, he used to work for the Indian government. And I was sort of very lucky to be exposed to a lot of the information age equipment, which most other people in India did not have access to. So I would, hang out in his office and play with oscilloscopes and so on and so forth, and spectrum analyzers. And so I just sort of grew up around a lot of this technology that I had no idea what it was and how to use, but I kind of tinkered with it and figured things out. And then I think from an entrepreneurship perspective, I actually can't really explain this, but I've always had this idea that I don't want to work for anybody. And so, after my grad school, when DARPA essentially offered to fund my previous company, Ayasdi, it was a no-brainer to start it because I was going to do one way or another. I was not going to work for anybody else. It does turn out, by the way, that when you start a company and are the CEO, you work for everybody, including the investors and your assistants. So in some sense, you do end up working for other people.
So that's great. So speaking about your education, I wanted to ask, what are some of the biggest differences between the education in India and Delhi vs Stanford University here in the US?
Yeah, I think that's a great question as well. I think education in India was very different. It's sort of, I don't think I can say too many good things about it. Um, but now that I've seen sort of two modes of education in the US. I've seen my graduate work at Stanford, which was great, and I learned a lot, and I really enjoyed it. But then also now that I have kids, I have a 9-year-old and a 5-year-old. Now that I see them going to school, I think school in general has been quite disappointing in the US as well. So I don't think US is doing that much better compared to what we had in India from a early schooling perspective. But I certainly think that the graduate school was dramatically better in the US. And in fact, even the undergrad in the US that I saw, sort of Stanford undergrads, that was a much more rigorous program than what I did in India. So I think there is certainly a lot to be said, and I do honestly think that fundamentally it boils down to the fact that at least for a science and sort of STEM based careers or STEM based path, I think the fact that in general there is respect for US and basic science in the US, I think drives a lot of that difference. While I think in India it's still kind of missing, the respect for research and science. Culturally, I don't think we are there yet.
Okay, so that's great. I really wanted to talk about what got you interested in the technology field at early age and some of the greatest hardships of being a tech entrepreneur. Because when you created Ayasti, there must have been a lot of hardships and a lot of learning opportunities you had coming from India, coming from an immigrant perspective. So I really wanted to learn about like how'd you go through all those hardships and some of those hardships you had when making Ayasti.
Yeah, so we had this professor at Stanford. Her name was Tina Seelig. I think she still teaches at Stanford. She's an amazing professor, and she teaches this course on management and creativity. One line that she uses that sort of stuck with me is that every problem is an opportunity. And so I think from that perspective, yes, I've had lots of problems and so on and so forth, but I don't ever feel like things have been unsurmountable or too
Hmm.
difficult. And so to give you a sense, when I showed up to the US, I did not have enough money to pay for grad school, and grad school is expensive. And my plan was that I think I had like $6,000, which is enough to cover 2 quarters of Stanford grad school. So I figured that if it turns out that I'm not able to find any way of continuing with grad school in 2 quarters, then I will head back to India. And I used to work at Texas Instruments before I came to the
Hmm.
US
Yeah.
for like 10 or 11 months, something like that. And I was pretty sure that I could get a job at Texas Instruments if I had to return. So then when I came to Stanford, my first order of business was to figure out how to not have to go back to India and complete my studies. And so what I did, perhaps in bad taste now, but what I did was I basically wrote a program to spam all the professors, basically saying, I am this grad student and I've entered the US and Stanford, and I'm looking for internships and research assistantships. And back then, spam filters weren't really that great. So I think I was able to send a few, close to 1,000 emails over a weekend. And over the next couple of weeks, I met with professors in all different areas. Um, and eventually, I found one in the aero and astro department, who basically, I remember I sat in his office. His name is Anthony Jameson. He's an amazing researcher. I sat in his office and he basically asked me questions about computational fluid dynamics that I had obviously no idea what it was, and I had didn't know what to do about it. And eventually, I think after like 10 minutes, he was like, "So you don't really know anything, and you want me to, fund your next couple of quarters of education in Stanford? Why?" And I basically just said, "Yeah, I don't know anything, but I'm sure I can learn anything." And he agreed. I got very lucky, and it turned out that we published some great research. In fact, I built a supercomputer based on DSPs, uh,
Oh,
again back in 2003, and he was super excited. We took it to NSF for funding, and NSF said that you've already built it, so why do you need funding? Because you get funding for research. This is really stuff that you've already done. And so I was sort of out on my back again because I had to figure out another source of funding. Then I found a similar position in the mechanical department, basically, essentially doing partial differential equations, but now instead of using DSPs, I think I was one of the first users of GPUs back then because GPU programming hadn't really caught on. And so I basically built the same thing, but the same thing happened. We submitted the research for funding and really got denied because it had already been done, so to speak. Then I spent about a half a year in Andrew Ng's lab, building robotics. Robotics is is a huge passion of mine, and then eventually I landed in the math department. So I think I can like go on and on. There's been lots of challenges, lots of times that
hmm
I really didn't know what to do and how to proceed from there. When I was raising money for Ayasti, we did a seed round with Floodgate, and that was fine. But for our Series A, it was very, very difficult to find investors because nobody knew anything about machine learning. It took me almost 9 to 10 months. Eventually, I ran into Vinod Khosla, who had himself a background in machine learning in his graduate days and remembered it, and so it got financed. So again, lots of twists and turns and lots of places where I thought, okay, this is it, but somehow we were able to turn things around.
So that's great. I love how you talked about how every hardship gives you a new opportunity. So let's talk about how you started Ayasti. When did you actually know that you were going to go into the relatively new field of AI and data at that time? And what really pivoted you and set you on the track of going into the AI and data side of tech?
Yeah, absolutely. So what happened was, as I said, I was working in Andrew's lab, and building robotics at Stanford. And I realized that in robotics, every time you do anything, you had to learn a different area. So like, for example, if you had to solve a vision problem, then you have to go learn about computer vision and its own language and its own jargon. If you had to solve a locomotion type problem, you have to go learn inverse kinematics and its own jargon and its own language. And that was deeply unsatisfying because all of these things were related but different enough that you couldn't just, like, if you knew vision, you wouldn't obviously know kinematics. You would have to go learn something new, but not a whole lot new, but still something new. So I was really looking for areas where I could somehow unite all of these things and bring them together. And again, I can take no credit for this. My eventual PhD advisor, Gunnar, he's a mathematician. He was a chair of the math department at Stanford. He basically sent out an email in which he was looking for grad students, and essentially his pitch was that, hey, I'm working on this old area of math called topology, and we will be able to use topology to merge all of these different areas together. And so that was fascinating. So I went and listened to him, and yeah, and basically we decided on the spot that I would go work with him and complete my graduate work. And what happened over the years, couple of years there, is DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, realized at the same time that almost all of their scientific research financing was going into the creation of data. and they felt that people
Mhm.
who were constructing the best data were likely not the best people to analyze it. They felt that it had actually become cheaper to construct more complex data than the exact scientific question that you wanted to ask as a scientist. So by default, people were constructing these complicated data sets and asking very narrow questions of the data. So DARPA thought, there must be ways in which we can automatically learn from the data that's been collected outside of the narrow questions that the researchers wanted to ask. So we ended up applying this area of math called topology to all these various areas of scientific discipline, in breast cancer research and hippocampus research and image compression and econometrics. And we showed over and over again that we could build this topology based software to which you could expose complex data sets, and it would come up with scientific hypotheses, and it would come up with the results that people might not have stumbled upon by themselves. And again, we did not think of it as AI back then, honestly, because yeah, I mean, we were coming more from the math perspective. We did not sort of think of it as AI. um, but then obviously when we started commercializing it, we realized sort of the best way of talking about it from a public consciousness perspective was to discuss it in terms of AI.
Mhm.
And today, there is this, and when I say today, it's now popular, an area of machine learning called unsupervised machine learning. So that was essentially what we had built, using sort of a slightly different path to get there.
That's great. So, when you created Ayasti, I just wanted to know when you were founding Ayasti and you were growing Ayasti, what do you think made Ayasti so unique and what made it so successful in the terms of data analysis and math?
So what made it unique is that there was nobody else. So I think there were like two interesting parts to it. The first was the machine learning itself. And I think the second thing that we did, which I think was really amazing, and I think still to date there is nobody else who does it, is that we paired the machine learning with human understandable visualization. So for example, when we sold software to a drug researcher at, let's say, Johnson and Johnson, there they could all of a sudden their data became tangible, and it was very different from the kind of visualization that they were used to. So when you think about visualization, people are used to regular histograms and bar charts and things like that, and that's fine, they are valuable. But the way that we built our visualizations were in the form of a network, by default. And so this interactive network visualization basically allowed people to interrogate their data in a way that they would not have been able to because it was so much. So maybe let me give you some concrete example. Right? Imagine that you are a researcher, and you're researching some cancer. Typically, the way that drug discovery works is that some scientists will essentially collect a whole bunch of tumor samples, and then for every tumor sample they will collect lots of data. So for example, they will collect, to make things simpler, a gene expression data set. For every tumor they will basically find the activity of, let's say, 23,000 genes for that sample. So if you had, let's say, 500 samples, now you have a sort of an Excel spreadsheet of 500 samples with 23,000 columns, which are the genes, the protein levels. And what IASI software allowed them to do was to essentially interrogate all of this data in a very visual and interactive way, as opposed to saying, oh, you know what, I think gene 5 and gene 10 are related. So let me see the activity of gene 5 and gene 10 and see maybe there's a delayed activity or something. So instead of asking these sort of point by point one, questions, they could visualize all of the data all together with the help of machine learning. So that was pretty unique. And then the second thing we did was we essentially, over and above this visualization, we realized that AI is useless without user experience. We realized that at the end of the day, the end people who have to use it, unless they are able to uh, integrate it into their daily lives, they would not be successful. So while getting a researcher at some pharma company is relatively easier in the sense that they are already technical, but for the company to scale, we had to make sure that our software would be usable by non-technical people. And so what we ended up doing was we ended up creating vertically specific applications that whose user experience was custom and tailor built for that application. So as an example, we had an application for money laundering that we sold into large banks, whose user experience was customized for investigators, who are like regular people investigating transactions. And so the machine learning had to do its job and like produce the things that they should investigate and things that they should not look at and so on. But the user experience of how somebody then actually did the investigation and measured the data and so on and so forth was really critical. So I think over and above the machine learning, these two things really benefited us. The first was the visualization of complex data sets, and the second was sort of the very custom user experience for custom applications.
Okay, so I also want to talk about one more thing. When you created Ayasti, what was the biggest accomplishment you had and just the biggest, like the biggest milestone you hit when you were founding Ayasti?
You mean before or during?
Uh, During Ayasti, yeah.
There were lots lots of things, but I will say, look, most companies that don't succeed because they never make money.
Hmm.
So I think at Ayasti we had a drumbeat of like, not only were we making fantastic products, but we were successfully selling them. So there are lots of things that I'm proud of, but I think from a business perspective, the most important thing about a business is that it has to make money, it has to be profitable. So I think from that perspective, I'm very proud of what we did at Ayasti. We consistently made, lots of revenue and, sold into all these Fortune 50 customers.
Hmm.
So outside of that, one thing that I'm super proud of is that Ayasti, since the founders were all academics, myself included, we basically had an academic collaboration program where we used to give our software for free to academics across the world, other academics. So we had, researchers from Stanford and Oxford and Mount Sinai and the Tel Aviv University use our software and discover scientific things that they would not have otherwise found. So there is lots of research that's been published based on our software. And when we were hiring people to come work for Ayasi, that's the thing that we used to highlight, is that look, we will make money, of course, but you should come to us because this is the kind of impact that our software has on the real world and real people and real science. So I
That's
was super.
great. So I want to talk about the future that you have in stake. Are there any new projects or companies that you are thinking about making, such as Thread Robotics? And what are you going to do in the future? How do you think you're going to accomplish these projects?
Yeah, so as you know, I'm building Thread Robotics these days, and the idea for Thread Robotics is that we basically are developing robotics so that we can automate in vitro fertilization. Now, in vitro fertilization is a very expensive and very error prone process. So for
Hmm.
people who
Yeah.
are unable to conceive naturally, in the US, a typical an average customer spends about $60,000 on the procedure. Uh,
Wow.
Whoever is affected by the problem, of course, and only a third of them are ever successful. So it's a very expensive procedure. It fails often, and it's a desperate need. And if people are unable to conceive, it's a very desperate need for them.
Yeah.
Um, so that's kind of what's motivating for this business. And then from a technology perspective, the thing that I love about it is that um, when you so one of my learnings from Ayasti, I actually tell you a story. So what happened was, one of our first customers at Ayasti was this pharma company called Boehringer Ingelheim. They are a huge German pharma company. They had a drug that was failing phase 3 clinical trials. And the way drugs are developed is, you basically develop the idea for a drug and then you basically take it through multiple phases. So phase one is something like, okay, is it even safe? Can you give it to people, and is it safe? And oftentimes a lot of that is done with animal models, like you don't actually give it to people.
Yeah.
Then phase two is sort of toxicity, right? Then you actually dose people and see, okay, is it safe for people? And then phase three is for efficacy, is to see, okay, so it's safe for people, it's safe, and so now we want to see how does it work in people and so on. And to give you a sense, right, by the time a pharma company reaches a phase 3 clinical trial, they've typically already spent a few $100 million on
Wow.
one. So it's really expensive. So anyway, this company Boehringer Ingelheim, they had this drug that was failing phase 3 clinical trials, and it was failing for a very particular reason. So the FDA told them that the drug works and it's safe. That's all good, but the mechanism of action of the drug, sort of the internal method by which the drug acts, is not differentiated. In other words, there are other drugs on the market that are also effective, which work on the same principle.
Okay.
And so that's the reason why they were failing. So they used our software, and they were able to find in their pre-existing data. So they didn't have to spend money create more data. In their pre-existing data, they found a subgroup of patients for whom the mechanism was differentiated.
Hmm.
So they were able to submit that evidence to the FDA, and the drug got clearance, and they make $1 billion a year
Oh,
from the.
wow.
So the story is that we essentially they bought our software, and we were like, I think 3 or 4 people in a garage back then, right? So we were still very very small. And when we were negotiating the deal, I basically said, hey, so you're going to use it for this drug discovery thing. It's important for you. Pay us like $1 million a year for 3 years.
Okay.
And they agreed, and we were happy. We were, we were high fiving each other. It was an amazing. It was amazing. But then when their drug passed, and I realized that they are going to make $1 billion a year, I was
Yeah.
super resentful.
Oh.
And it took me it took me a year or so to realize that I was wrong. I should not have been resentful. I got what I asked for. I asked for
Hmm.
$1 million a year. They gave me $1 million a year. So why should I be resentful? And personally, I realized that for me, I was resentful because you know I felt that I did not capture the value of what we had built. I felt that I
Yeah.
I let it go for cheap.
Hmm.
So for me, the lesson was that whenever anytime any next company that I built, it was not going to be just a here's a tool that I've built, use the tool, and off you go, which is fair, by the way. There's nothing wrong with
Yeah.
that, and obviously I've been successful doing that in the past. But personally, for me, I want to now build companies where I can control the end-to-end value chain, so vertically integrated company. And so that's the other thing that's attractive about Thread Robotics. It's a very difficult technical problem. We think we can solve it. We are pretty certain we can solve it, but it's not a guarantee by far. It is meaningful in the sense that it has meaningful impact on real people's lives.
Definitely.
It's a meaningful problem. And three, from a business perspective, it's a problem that we can own end to end. So I don't have to build some part of it and sell it to somebody. I can build
Hmm.
the technology and I can serve the end consumer directly with the technology that we've built in the form of our own clinics.
Hmm.
And that's kind of the thing that motivates me about Thread.
That's great. So for our participants, I just wanted to let them know, can you give us what's the goal of Thread Robotics and what do you want Thread Robotics to accomplish in the future?
Yeah. So the goal of Thread Robotics is we want to double the chances of success in IVF, and over time we want to reduce the cost of the procedure by 10x.
Okay.
So that's the end-to-end goal of Thread Robotics is we want to make more people who are infertile be successful,
Hmm.
and we want it to not cost like $60,000. We want it to cost like $5,000, and hopefully.
Okay. Okay. So I also wanted to talk. So you're an extremely successful entrepreneur. I
not
wanted you to
not
give some,
extremely successful, slightly successful,
okay,
maybe.
but still considered successful compared to a lot of other entrepreneurs, tech entrepreneurs, most likely. I wanted you to give us a couple tips to us aspiring entrepreneurs that are in college or in high school, and how do we basically grow our ideas to the size of Ayasti?
So, yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I look, so I think I have now seen two routes, right, to
Hmm.
this to making it work. So one route was the route that we took with Ayasti, where we had a fundamental innovation, and we figured out how to commercialize it.
Hmm.
That path, it took a lot of years of work and discipline, in the sense that like all our first 15 employees had all PhDs in math or computer science or physics or biology or something, right? So it took a lot of discipline to make it. It was very defensible in the sense that once we had built it, it was very hard to copy. So there's still
Hmm.
nobody else who can copy it.
Yeah.
Uh, so that's actually one route of of taking your ideas and building them is to build something that is so defensible that the set of people who can accomplish it is basically you and whoever you're building the company with. That's one way of doing it. So for example, a lot of the company in the biospace, new technologies, like companies that, for example, are monetizing CRISPR, right? They come out of this mold.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's one. So then the second way of building companies is you basically do a sort of tops down and bottoms up business analysis, right? You basically say, okay, so here's something that I believe is a problem in the world. And the thing that I think most people get wrong is when they're thinking about an idea or a company, they don't quantify the problem. So, for example, in fact, somebody sent me a pitch a couple days ago in which they basically said, roughly speaking, and I don't want to give away any, too much, but they basically said consumers
Obviously.
don't have enough privacy online, and so we are going to solve that problem. Again, I'm making it even less detailed than what they sent me. It was better than
Mm-hmm.
what they said. But the problem that I saw in their materials and their pitch deck uh, was that they did not quantify it. Right? They did not say, okay, so as a motherhood and apple pie statement, yeah, I can buy that there isn't enough privacy online and there should be more privacy online. But there's no quantification of, do people care about it? Will they pay for it? How much does it cost somebody? Uh, so I think the quantification of problem is really important, and I think people don't spend nearly enough time quantifying the problem and understanding it in great detail. Um, so again, my advice to turn this as from criticism into advice is, if you're thinking of businesses and you're thinking of problems, a business exists to solve a problem.
Yeah.
Quantify the problem in great detail. In fact, I will even go as far as to say that the solution is almost irrelevant as long as you know you can build it.
Mm-hmm.
Right, when you're pitching to investors or you're pitching to employees, if you demonstrate an understanding of the problem, anybody who listens to you will give you the benefit of the doubt that you will be able to solve it. That if you know it in such great detail, that you will probably be able to come up with a solution.
Mm-hmm.
So that's number one, is to quantify the problem. The second thing I would say is, and again, I think I kind of feel like maybe I'm a bit old, which is why I'm saying this thing, is that personally I don't understand a lot of consumer businesses, so that's a bias I have. So for example, I'm not the kind of person who can ever create something like an Instagram, because I honestly don't. I can't see the path from that to money, which I think is what the business is easily. And again, I think that probably says something about my age and the generation I grew up in. But I think there is a whole set of businesses that kind of rely on, if it becomes big, then something happens. And I would say, statistically speaking, they tend to be less successful. Rather, less of them tend to be successful. It's not that they tend to be less successful, but less of them tend to be successful. So my advice generally would be to sort of steer away from the kinds of things where it becomes it to for it to become a hit, it has to become a cultural phenomenon, because it's really, really hard to do. And it's, you may do it, you may not do it. It's a hit and miss process from that perspective. And then the third and the final thing that I would say is, let's say that you have decided to do something, that you found a problem, you quantified it, and you've decided that that's the problem you're going to solve now. What I would then say is that make a list of risks, and rank them by what would make it fail the most, and only solve the risks in that order. What people typically do is that when they start a company or start any new project, they solve problems in the order of doability. That, I can do this, let me go do this, because it feels like you're making progress. While I think that is the exact wrong order to do things in. The right order to do things in is basically figure out what is the thing that will make you fail the most, solve that first,
Yeah.
then move on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. So I think prioritization in order of risk is important.
Okay.
uh, yeah.
Okay. So I also want to talk about one more thing. So after you sold Ayasti and before you started Thread Robotics, what are some of the things you did in your downtime? What are some of your outside interests?
uh, I guess I am a kind of a boring person. My outside interests also involve robotics and computer
Hmm.
programming and so on. So I I think over the past year I've been writing a symbolic regressor. It's a particular type of machine learning algorithm. Um, and I have a robotics lab at home. I love robotics, so I've been building stuff at home. I did take some time off with my kids. We went to Mexico, we went to Costa Rica, but I don't have many other kind of outside interests. My interests are all sort of technical, and so I've been reading science books, and I've been building robotics, and I've been writing some machine learning.
That's great. So I also want to talk about one more thing. What do you think's in the future for robotics and medical technology? Like, how do you think robotics is going to impact the medical like field in different ways in the future?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. There are so when we look at medicine, right, we should look at different scales. So there is the intracellular scale, in which we want to manipulate stuff that is inside the cells. So that's what things like CRISPR do, right?
Hmm.
There is a cellular scale where you want to manipulate cells, which is kind of what we are building at Thread. There is a scale of tissues, right, where you are, let's say people have their tendon replaced, or their some muscle injuries, things like that, right? Uh, and then there is a scale of sort of uh, topical medication, right? In some sense, where somebody interacts with your body, uh, but it's not to, so let's say you go to a doctor's visit, and these days due to COVID, maybe you're not able to see the doctor. uh, I think that telepresence robots will be a commonplace in our near future,
Hmm.
because it doesn't make sense to sort of to increase the risk by having two people meet and so on and so forth. So I think if you look at these various scales, uh, I think some of these scales are difficult and some of these scales are easy, but they're all interesting in their own different ways. So for example, the intracellular scale, where you're modifying things inside the cell, obviously the only way that we can do this is by using molecular machinery like CRISPR, or I'm sure there'll be other things as well. The cellular scale, which is kind of again where Thread Robotics is operating, I believe that's where robotics and machine learning has thus far not been applied. And so, that's what we are pioneering by using robotics and machine learning for cellular scale, where we're sort of manipulating individual eggs and sperm cells and so on and so forth. Then I think on the tissue scale, there are companies like Intuitive Surgical that already sort of build robots that allow surgeons to do surgeries on tissues and so on and so forth. So I think that already exists. I think it is not as commonplace as it's going to become, and it's not automated. It's kind of like an operator operating with a joystick. So I think those things will also evolve in the sense that it'll be more automated and so on. And then I think the last place, like I mentioned, is sort of where you're not necessarily doing anything to the body, but we are just sort of using telepresence and so on. So I think all of these areas are going to grow dramatically, uh, roughly in that order, in the sense that telepresence will grow the fastest because it's kind of the easiest thing to do and the most obvious. Uh, After that will be the tissue robotics, again, because the robots already exist. We just have to keep making them smarter. Followed by what we are doing, the cellular robotics, and then followed by things like CRISPR, because they're really hard to do in numbers. So that's what I would say.
Okay, that's great. So we're nearing the end of our session, and I'm going to give some time for the participants to ask some questions. But
Sure.
before that, I'm just going to I have one last question.
Sure.
So I wanted to know, for Thread Robotics, you've just started a couple months ago. What's the next step for you? How are you going to grow Thread Robotics, and what are some of the different features and different, like, I don't know, technologies that you're going to try to make for it?
Yeah. So for Thread Robotics, there are kind of two major sets of problems. The first set of problem is the commercialization problem, which is, when we are commercializing it, uh, how do we attract customers to a clinic? At the end of the day, it's a vertically integrated business, so that's the most important question, right? We can build the tech, but if nobody shows up, then we might as well not have built it. So that's sort of one thread of what we are doing right now is basically we are running through the customer acquisition channels to figure out how to optimize those. And again, I'm saying this first, even though that's the thing that we are going to do as a business last, but we are going to work on it first because that is the biggest risk. We don't perceive the technology to be the biggest risk. We believe we can build it. Uh, but if we built it and nobody showed up, that would suck. That would be the worst thing to happen. So that's why we are solving that problem first. Then the second thing that we are doing in parallel is we are developing the technology. So that part is, um, I wouldn't say it's straightforward. We know what to do, but there's a lot of steps that we have to go through. So, we have just built a lab here in Mountain View. We are acquiring samples and we are generating training data by using a sort of whole set of embryologists who are labeling the data for us. And then once the labeling is complete, then we will actually build a system to use it in real time, and then we'll build sort of the user experience for the real time. So again, I think these are things that we are sure we can do. We just have to go do them.